Hey everybody. Today I want to talk about decentralization. So I would like to make a bold statement to you. I would like to say that Bitcoin is the most powerful model for developing technology that we've ever seen in human history. And I really mean that, not as hyperbole, but as practical fact. And so I like to talk about this idea of Bitcoin as this first example of a decentralized application. And when I say decentralized application, I mean four core aspects that I believe have made Bitcoin so successful as a technology and as a model that we ought to emulate for building other types of technology. And so let me go through real quickly these four aspects that Bitcoin has really pioneered when it comes to building decentralized systems. The first aspect, of course, is it's an open source system. It's not a closed proprietary standard that a company has proposed, but rather it can access the smartest and most brilliant people in the world that are interested in this type of technology to add to the way the cryptographic ledger works, the way the Bitcoin system functions, and that's proven extremely powerful in the last 5 years. As Bitcoin has evolved, it's attracted cryptographic experts from all around the world to improve the system and build upon it. And so having open source as its foundation really changed the system from something that could have been a small cloistered experiment within a company to a global standard. So the second aspect is it wasn't just an open source project. It had this innovative idea of attaching a digital token to the use of that application. So by that I mean simply that to use the Bitcoin network, you have to have Bitcoins. And that simple, elegant way of monetizing Bitcoin, that simple association between Bitcoins and the use of the Bitcoin network was all the incentive structure that was needed in order to imbue that network with incentives that made people go and want to grow that ecosystem, to add to the development, to find merchants. In one way, you could say that the entire monetary structure of Bitcoin is captured in 4 lines of code. And that's incredibly powerful. We've come up with these complex systems for describing incentives, and we have these corporate structures and different incentive structures. And here's just a beautifully elegant system for capturing all of those motives and translating them in just to a few lines of code. And so having that open source, again, tokenized and attached to that digital token really gave value to the Bitcoin network. It created a scarce resource that people had to buy in order to access this network. The third aspect that's really powerful with Bitcoin is the fact that there is no central point of failure. Bitcoin adopted this ethos of a peer-to-peer network and allowed for the storage of all the data that was relevant to the operation of the Bitcoin network. You could download all of the transactions in the history of Bitcoin onto a Bitcoin node, and all of those peers in the peer-to-peer network have a copy of all those transactions. That's really powerful. There became no way for the Bitcoin network to fail. There wasn't an issue if power went out in one country and all of a sudden the network would go down. It was geographically distributed across thousands and eventually millions of copies around the world. So that idea that we want to build anti-fragile systems, we want to build systems that will work on a 24/7 basis with 0 interruptions, and they're not subject to geographical or jurisdictional risk, is an incredibly powerful one and separates Bitcoin from all of the predecessors that attempted to solve this problem of how to transfer value, but using centralized mechanisms. So again, open source, had its own token to monetize, decentralized all the storage of its data. And finally, it has a cryptographic mechanism. It has a consensus mechanism that proves a node has actually added value to the network. In the case of Bitcoin, we call this proof of work. It's an implementation of what's known as hash cache, which is showing that a computer has actually added value to the Bitcoin network. Now, this was a stroke of genius in that what Bitcoin needed was a high level of security. And in order to achieve that high level of security, it needed a lot of computational power for computers to add that to the network. And by proving that a node had added value, you now had a mechanism where you could reward those nodes for providing those values with additional Bitcoin tokens. As we all know, for those familiar with the technical aspects, there are right now 25 Bitcoins created every block, and that's a competition where all of these computers are providing that hashing power. So very simple mechanisms, these four characteristics of open source, using a token, decentralizing the records, and having a consensus mechanism have built a system like we've never seen before. Never in history have we seen what is now a $6 billion ecosystem emerge without any central leadership, without sort of the traditional structures that we've seen before. And so that's really incredible. And what I'm proposing to you today is that the idea of this is Bitcoin is not unique in that we can apply this model to other technologies that aren't payments and that aren't currencies. And that's really powerful because you begin to open up your mind to the other types of technology that this can change. So we've talked about the Bitcoin protocol. Last year, I was thinking about this subject a great deal, and I came upon the master protocol in August of last year. And this is sort of the first project that tried to replicate the model of Bitcoin outside of simply an alternative coin that was competing as a payment network or as a currency. Instead, they wanted to do a different set of features and a different set of technologies. In this case, smart property, contracts, decentralized exchanges, and so forth, using their own token based on open source with all of the data stored in a decentralized way on top of the Bitcoin ledger and with its own mechanism for deciding if those contracts had been triggered and building consensus within their network. And so the master protocol has been extremely successful in using this model as Bitcoin did to build out its features, to do this in a decentralized way. And I think it's really just offering the beginning of where we're headed. So I like to talk about sort of the infrastructure that I think is going to emerge in this next 12 months. Because we see with especially these three projects here, the Safe Network, Ethereum, and Open Garden, an opportunity to apply this type of model to really important, really large-scale platforms that we're going to build incredible technologies on for the decades to come. And so I just want to cover these projects very shortly. The goal here is the major pieces of technology we need to decentralize next, now that we have a value network, now that we have a decentralized exchange to trade that value and a way to define new tokens on top of the Bitcoin network, is all applications you can think of on the internet often use these three components. They use storage to store data, they use compute to do calculations, and they often use bandwidth to transfer information around. And so, as earlier presentations mentioned, the Safe Network is a project by MadeSafe to decentralize the way that we store data. And so through the BitAngels, we had an opportunity to talk and partner with MadeSafe earlier this year in January and February, and we realized that there was an opportunity to take the Bitcoin model and apply it to what they were doing. So the Safe Network operates on safe coins, and anybody that wants to store information, whether it's a website or a personal file, in a decentralized way can simply buy safe coins off the market and use those in order to store those records on the safe network. The amazing thing about the safe network is there is no central server. This is a network made up of nodes that are all storing small amounts of the information from your file in a completely encrypted and safe way. And so that's an incredible concept, because all of a sudden, instead of when Amazon Web Services has a hiccup or there's a power outage, a quarter of the internet turns off and Netflix goes down, this is now a redundant and anti-fragile system where that can never happen again. And so I'm extremely excited about their technology, and they're in testnet now. Hundreds of developers have been flocking to work on their project, and so really encourage people to check out what they're doing. Second, I just want to briefly mention Ethereum, because I think this is the first practical application that we've seen in the area of decentralized compute, in the sense that using Ether to run a contract is basically like paying Amazon Web Services to run a script or a program or a website for you. And it's a really compelling technology that they've created there. I think we'll see more examples of this. This isn't general compute, this is something more narrow, but this is going to be really powerful in unleashing the ways that people can use creativity around the scripts that they run. And third is Open Garden. For those familiar with mesh networks, this is the ability to share the internet from your phone. I mean, everybody in this room right now has a smartphone in their pocket. How many of you are sharing internet with each other? You could be, the technology is there, but you have no incentive to do it. You know nothing about how much money you're losing by not doing that behavior. And so Open Garden is going to be releasing a protocol in a few months that will let people share internet from their routers, from their phones, from their different devices with each other, and get mesh coins or some token that incentivizes them to do that. So in similar to the way people are adding computational power to the Bitcoin network to increase the security, people would be adding available bandwidth to increase the amount of bandwidth available on this network. So these three projects are sort of really powerful ways that we can actualize this new model into different technical stacks. And these are just three examples. We're going to see, in my belief, hundreds of different protocols emerge in the next few years that use this model to build out these types of technologies. So that's what really gets me excited. I think the drivers behind this are the idea that these decentralized systems can be more competitive, more efficient, and far more anti-fragile than existing systems. That's compelling for a lot of reasons. They're also jurisdiction agnostic and can serve a global audience in a way that we haven't seen before. So without too much further ado, I'll go ahead and jump into questions. For those that want to reach out to me, you can simply email me or go to the BitAngels Fund website, which is at bitangelsfund.co. And this is our entire focus. This is what I spend 80 hours a week on, is I want to build open source projects that use these token models, that decentralize the way they store their data, and have consensus mechanisms. And my big challenge to everyone in this community is to not just go build centralized services on top of this incredible Bitcoin protocol, but rather to think about how you decentralize what you're doing. And I would propose to you that's a harder task, but it's far more compelling. It's far more interesting if you say to me, I have found a way to decentralize this technology, and now it's scalable on a global basis. And so really encourage folks to reach out to us and tell us about what you want to build, and we're happy to think through with you, work on white papers together on how we decentralize all of these different services. I think it can be done. I think it will be done. That's part of why I coined the term Johnston's Law earlier this year about things being decentralized. Everything that can be decentralized will be decentralized. And I really believe that's sort of where we're going, and I think we'll see that play out more and more in the coming years. But I look forward to hearing what everybody comes up with and the questions that we have today. Thank you.
Questions? So if this were a baseball game, what inning are we in the Bitcoin ecosystem to start?
We're pretty early on. We're still probably in the second or third quarter.
So then where do we stand in terms of, this application layer and the types of projects that you're talking to?
Most of them are very early stage, so a lot of the projects are still working on white papers and specifications, but that's the time in which I want to be involved. I want to be involved. Don't come to me after you think you've already figured it out or after you've got it up and running. Don't worry about polishing it. I want to get involved when it's at the very beginning of how do we shape these incentives in the right way? How do we motivate different demographics? So for instance, I'll give you an example. The work I did with Ethereum, I was talking to Vitalik early on, and his initial idea was simply to reward miners for contributing this computational power to processing these contracts. And I said to him in a number of emails that you have to reward different demographics that add different types of value. And what I proposed is open source developers can add value to this system. You ought to allocate some of the tokens in your algorithm to open source developers, or the folks that can purchase the software as part of a crowd sale can add a lot of value to help support the development of this protocol. I ought to set aside some tokens for those folks. Or for instance, in the case of MadeSafe, they've set aside 10% of their tokens for third-party developers that are actually building on top of their system. I like to say it's the opposite of the Apple model. Instead of charging 30% to be on their ecosystem, they're actually paying folks 10% of all the tokens to put great software on their system, and the system automatically puts out those tokens on a proportional basis. And so people are coming up with all these creative models for what are the demographics we need to reward. Core developers, third-party developers, crowd sale participants, and then those providing the actual bandwidth or computer storage what's needed. So those are the discussions, those are the early stages I want to get involved in.
So how many applications today are, call it operational, on these platforms today?
It is really early stage. As I mentioned, the master protocol was sort of the first last year. We had MadeSafe do their crowd sale on April 22nd, just recently. Some of the ones upcoming that I'm really interested in is there's a decentralized API network that's going to allow third-party developers to offer access to their custom APIs, and it's called the API network, and it'll be powered by the API tokens, and that'll be launching in mid-June. There's a number of others that have been mentioned here today, such as storage, which I'm really excited about, actually built on top of the MadeSafe platform. That sort of does a decentralized version of Dropbox, if you will. And that's launching, I believe it's in July. And so I've got on my whiteboard 10 or 12 projects just in the next 4 months. Open Garden, for example, will be probably towards September when they come out. So Ethereum, I expect, will do their crowd sale in the next month or so, they've said. Hopefully they'll put a date on that soon. So there's going to be a wave of these projects that really the rubber is meeting the road this year. Probably you see a lot of them third and fourth quarter. And again, the big focus is the infrastructure level. I think a lot of folks are thinking about high-level protocols, but what we really need today is the infrastructure. And so that's what's getting built now. And I think next year we'll look more into higher-level protocols that can be built on top of these systems.
So how many of these applications or crowd sales do you think will have occurred by the end of the year, seeing that there was only a couple at the beginning?
I would guess that there'll be hundreds, maybe more than hundreds, maybe thousands. A lot of them will be small. It'll be people's personal ideas and things they want to experiment with. And so we'll have this ecosystem where there are some very large projects that are doing 10, 20, $30 million crowd sales in some cases. And I think you'll have a lot of smaller projects where people are doing much smaller events to support the development of an open source project or a much smaller sort of niche product that they want to build. But I imagine that we're going to get into a position where this becomes sort of the new website. Like, have you built a decentralized application on top of these type of systems? So I expect we'll see even more next year, but I think there'll probably be a few dozen major projects this year by the end.
And how many do you think you'll invest in by the end of the year?
Our goal for the fund has been to participate in 20 of the most important and early stage infrastructure plays. So we've made 5 or 10 commitments so far based on winners of hackathons or great protocols that we've been talking to. So actively seeking out more protocols that we can get involved in later this year, early next year. But yeah, that's sort of our target, is to get involved in these major infrastructure plays.
Any other questions? Thank you, David.
All right.